In the brutal winter of 1876, Dakota Territory was no place for the weak or the proud. Jedediah Carter had neither food nor horse, just calloused hands and a dying campfire. When he spotted the woman in the broken wheelchair at the abandoned depot, left behind like yesterday's newspaper, most men would have kept walking, but Jed wasn't most men. He had a code older than the territory itself. You share what little you have, especially with those who have less. She looked hungry, forgotten, helpless. So he broke his last piece of hardtack in half and offered it without a word. She accepted, with quiet grace, her eyes holding secrets he couldn't read. What this starving cowboy didn't know was that this plain-dressed woman was worth more than the entire territory they sat in. But would it matter when her true identity came to light? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Dakota Territory stretched endless and unforgiving, a canvas painted in shades of brown and grey that would test any man's resolve. In the winter of 1876, it was particularly merciless, with winds that cut through worn leather and frost that turned breath to crystals before it could warm a man's lungs. This was the world that had shaped Jedediah Carter. Though at 32, he looked older, lines etched deep around his eyes from squinting into prairie sun, hands scarred from rope burns and honest work, shoulders broad from years of wrestling with cattle and circumstance. Jed sat hunched over a pitiful fire, the flames dancing weakly against the evening chill. His horse was 3 days gone, taken by fever and the harsh reality of a winter that had come early and stayed late. His boots, once sturdy companions, now let in more cold than they kept out, the soles worn thin as his patience with fortunes. Cruel sense of humour. In his weathered hands he held what remained of his provisions, a piece of hardtack no bigger than his palm and tough as boot leather, the kind of meal that reminded a man just how far he'd fallen. But Jed had fallen before, and he'd risen again. That was the way of men like him, sons of the frontier, who understood that dignity wasn't measured in dollars, but in the choices a man made when nobody was watching. His father had taught him that, back when the family still had a homestead in Missouri, before the bank took it and scattered them like tumbleweeds across the plains. "Son," his father had said, pressing a tarnished brass compass into Jed's young hands, "this here belonged to your grandfather and his father before him. It'll point you true north, but more important, it'll remind you that a man's character is his only real compass. When you're lost, when you're hungry, when you're down to nothing, that's when you find out what you're really made of." The compass now rested in Jed's vest pocket, its weight a constant reminder of words spoken by a man who died with dirt under his fingernails and honor in his heart. That compass had guided him through cattle drives in Texas, mining claims in Colorado, and a dozen other ventures that had promised much and delivered little, but it had never steered him wrong when it came to doing right by others, even when doing right meant going without. The wind picked up, sending sparks from his meager fire dancing into the darkness like tiny prayers ascending to an indifferent heaven. Jed pulled his coat tighter and gazed across the desolate landscape toward the abandoned stagecoach depot 100 yards away. The building leaned precariously to one side, its weathered boards grey as old bones, windows dark and broken. It had been a way station once, back when the territory still held promise for men with dreams bigger than their bank accounts. Now it stood as a monument to abandoned hopes. Much like the woman he'd spotted there an hour earlier, she'd been left behind. That much was clear. Jed had watched from his distant camp as a stagecoach pulled away without her, its wheels churning, up dust that settled over her like a shroud. The other passengers hadn't even looked back. He could see her now, a slight figure hunched in what appeared to be a wheelchair, motionless as a statue carved from loneliness itself. Most men would have minded their own business. The territory was full of hard luck stories, and a man could go broke trying to solve them all. But Jed wasn't most men, and the sight of someone abandoned to the elements stirred something deep in his chest, a mixture of compassion and righteous anger that his father had called the fire of decent folk. He studied her from afar, noting the way she held herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with her circumstances. Even from this distance, there was something about her posture that spoke of strength rather than defeat. Her clothing appeared plain and travel-worn, but she didn't slump or wail or carry on the way folks sometimes did when misfortune struck. She simply sat there, accepting whatever fate the cold night might bring, and that quiet courage impressed him more than tears or pleading ever could. The temperature was dropping fast. Jed could feel it in his bones, the kind of cold that could turn a person to ice before morning came. He looked at his pathetic fire, then at the hardtack in his palm, then back at the woman. The arithmetic was simple and cruel. He had barely enough to keep himself alive until sunrise, and probably not enough for two. But arithmetic had never been his strong suit anyway, especially when it came to matters of the heart. His father's voice echoed in his memory. The measure of a man isn't what he has, son. It's what he's willing to share when he has nothing left to give. Jed stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement after hours of sitting in the cold. He tucked the hardtack into his pocket and began walking toward the depot, each step crunching softly in the frost-covered grass. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. The woman was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair pinned back in a simple style that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. Her wheelchair was indeed battered, its metal frame showing rust and wear, but it had been well maintained despite its obvious age. What struck him most were her hands. They rested folded in her lap with the grace of someone accustomed to stillness, but they were clean and well kept, not the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime struggling with poverty. There was something refined about her bearing, a quality that didn't quite match the plainness of her dress or the humble nature of her circumstances. When he was still 20 feet away, she looked up. Their eyes met across the empty space, and Jed felt something shift in his chest. Her gaze was steady and intelligent, neither pleading nor proud, but simply aware. She was taking his measure just as he was taking hers, and he sensed that very little escaped her notice. "Evening, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat, in the manner his mother had taught him back when good manners still mattered, in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. "Good evening," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent. He couldn't quite place. Eastern, perhaps, or maybe just educated in a way that marked her as different from the rough folk who usually populated this corner of nowhere. "Name's Jedediah Carter, but most folks call me Jed." He stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to crowd her or make her feel threatened. In his experience, a woman alone in the wilderness had good reason to be cautious around strangers. "Eloise," she said simply, not offering a last name. "Eloise Whittemore." The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it suggested it might mean something to others. There was a weight to it, a significance that seemed at odds with her current predicament. "Appears you've had some trouble with your transportation," Jed observed, nodding toward the wheel ruts where the stagecoach had departed. "The wheel broke," Eloise explained matter-of-factly. "My traveling companions decided I would slow down the repairs. They weren't wrong, I suppose." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a simple acknowledgement of reality that impressed Jed even more than her earlier composure. Lesser people might have raged against the unfairness of it all, but she seemed to accept her circumstances with the grace of someone who'd learned long ago that the world rarely bent to accommodate weakness. "Well, that's a shame," Jed said, though his words carried more weight than the simple phrase might suggest. A real shame. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind whispering between them like secrets shared by the night itself. Jed could feel the hardtack in his pocket, its rough edges pressing against his fingers as he wrestled with a decision that shouldn't have been difficult, but somehow was. Sharing food with a stranger was one thing when you had plenty. Sharing your last meal was something else entirely. But looking at Eloise Whittemore, sitting straight and proud despite being abandoned to face a killing frost. Jed realized there really wasn't a choice at all. His father's compass might point north, but his heart pointed toward something far more important than mere survival. It pointed toward the kind of man he wanted to be when his own time came to face whatever judgment awaited beyond the veil. "Miss Whittemore," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I don't suppose you've had supper yet." The hardtack broke with a sharp crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the evening. Jed held out the larger piece to Eloise, keeping the smaller portion for himself, with the unconscious generosity of a man who'd learned that hunger was easier to bear when it was shared. She accepted it with a nod of gratitude that spoke volumes without requiring words. They ate in companionable silence, the tough bread requiring considerable effort to chew, but providing a welcome warmth as it settled in their empty stomachs. Jed found himself studying Eloise in the flickering light of his distant fire, noting small details that intrigued him. Her dress, while plain and travel-worn, was well made with careful stitching that spoke of quality rather than economy. Her shoes, what he could see of them beneath her skirts, appeared sturdy but showed little wear, despite her obvious journey. Most curious of all was a small chain visible at her throat, disappearing beneath the collar of her dress. It caught the firelight briefly, gleaming with what looked suspiciously like gold, an expensive ornament for someone who'd been abandoned by fellow travelers as excess baggage. "This is very kind of you, Mr. Carter," Eloise said finally, brushing crumbs from her lap with movements that struck him as naturally graceful despite her circumstances. "Just Jed," he replied, "and it ain't kindness when it's the right thing to do." She smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "I suspect we might disagree on what constitutes the right thing, but I'm grateful nonetheless." Before Jed could ask what she meant by that curious statement, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night air. Both of them tensed, turning toward the darkness where two riders emerged from the gloom like specters born of shadow and ill intent. They rode with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted, their horses dancing nervously beneath them as they surveyed the scene. "Well, well," the larger of the two called out, his voice carrying the rough edge of a man who'd spent more time in saloons than Sunday services. "What have we here? A cripple and a tramp having themselves a little dinner party." Jed stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between the riders and Eloise, in a movement so natural it seemed instinctive. His hand didn't move toward his gun, he'd lost that along with his horse, but his shoulders squared in a way that suggested he wasn't planning to back down from whatever these men had in mind. "Evening, gentlemen," Jed said with the careful politeness of a man who knew trouble when he saw it. "Just travelers taking shelter for the night, no cause for concern." The second rider, younger but with eyes that held a coldness beyond his years, laughed without humor. "Travelers," he says, "with what? That broken-down wheelchair and the rags on your backs?" "We're not looking for trouble," Eloise said quietly, her voice steady despite the obvious threat the men presented. "Trouble." The larger man dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with authority. "Lady, you are trouble!" Word's been passing up and down the territory about a woman in a wheelchair asking questions she shouldn't be asking, poking her nose into business that ain't hers. Jed felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He glanced at Eloise, but her expression remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing about what the man might be referring to. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said calmly. "I'm just traveling through." "Are you now?" The man stepped closer, and Jed moved to intercept him. "Funny thing about that. See, we heard tell of a certain Miss Whittemore who's been stirring up old grievances, making claims about property that's been settled legal and proper. Wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The name clearly meant something to these men, though Jed still couldn't fathom what. But he could see the way Eloise's hands tightened slightly in her lap, the only outward sign that the confrontation was affecting her more than she let on. Property disputes are common in the territory, she replied evenly. I'm afraid I can't help you with whatever concerns you might have. The younger rider had dismounted as well, and both men now stood between the travelers and any hope of easy escape. Not that escape was much of an option with Eloise in her wheelchair and Jed on foot, but the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Here's the thing, Miss Whittemore, the larger man continued, his tone taking on a conversational quality that somehow made him more threatening than outright aggression would have. There's folks who'd prefer if certain old business stayed buried, folks with the means to make sure it stays that way, if you catch my meaning. I'm afraid I don't, Eloise said, though Jed suspected she understood perfectly well. The man's patience appeared to be wearing thin. Then let me speak plain. You turn around and head back where you came from, or we'll be forced to help you understand why that's in your best interests. That was when Jed stepped fully between the men and Eloise, his voice taking on a quality that suggested depths these strangers hadn't yet plumbed. Seems to me the lady's made it clear she's not the person you're looking for. Maybe it's time you boys rode on and let honest folks get some rest. The larger man looked at him with the kind of amusement a cat might show when discovering a mouse willing to stand and fight. Honest folks, that what you think you are, cowboy? I think I'm a man who doesn't take kindly to strangers threatening women, Jed replied quietly. Is that so? The younger rider's hand moved casually toward his gun. And what exactly do you plan to do about it, seeing as how you appear to be somewhat under-equipped for the conversation? It was true. Jed had no weapon, no horse, and no clear advantage except for the righteousness of his position and whatever experience had taught him about handling men like these. But sometimes that had to be enough. I plan to stand right here, he said simply. And whatever business you think you have with Miss Whittemore, you'll conduct it through me. The two men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. What had seemed like easy intimidation of a helpless woman had suddenly become more complicated, with the addition of a man who appeared willing to die before backing down. You know what, friend? The larger man said finally. Maybe we were hasty. Maybe this isn't the Miss Whittemore we're looking for after all. He remounted his horse with deliberate slowness, his companion following suit. But before they rode away, he leaned forward in his saddle and addressed Eloise directly. Course, if you should happen to be the lady we're seeking, you might want to consider real careful whether your business is worth the cost it might bring to folks who try to help you. With that, they wheeled their horses around and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats and the acrid smell of their presence. Jed remained standing until the sound faded completely, then turned back to Eloise. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, gratitude, mixed with something that might have been regret. Thank you, she said quietly. That was more than I had any right to expect. Miss Whittemore, Jed said, settling down beside her wheelchair. I get the feeling there's more to your story than broken stagecoach wheels and traveling companions with poor manners. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dying fire in the distance. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of decision that suggested she was crossing some internal threshold. There is, she admitted. The question is whether you're prepared to hear it, knowing that it might put you in considerably more danger than you bargained for when you offered to share your supper. Jed looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the quiet strength in her bearing, the intelligence in her eyes, and the careful way she chose her words. Whatever her story was, he suspected it was going to change everything about his simple plan to survive until morning. Mom, he said finally, I reckon a man's got to stand for something or he'll fall for anything. If you're willing to trust me with the truth, I'm willing to hear it. Eloise nodded slowly, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the hidden chain at her throat. Very well, Mr. Carter. But first, would you be willing to travel with me? For protection, you understand. I have business to attend to, and after tonight I suspect I'll need whatever help I can find. Looking into her eyes, Jed realized that his simple act of sharing a meal had just become something far more complicated and potentially dangerous than he'd ever imagined. But some decisions couldn't be unmade, and some roads, once taken, led only forward. "Yes, Mom," he said. "I reckon I would." Dawn broke grey and reluctant over the Dakota Territory, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of silver that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Jed had slept fitfully beside the dying embers of his fire, one ear always alert for the return of their unwelcome visitors. Eloise had remained in her wheelchair throughout the long night, wrapped in a travelling blanket that had seen better days, but appeared to be of fine wool beneath its layer of trail dust. As the first light touched her face, Jed was struck again by the contradictions she presented. Her features were refined, aristocratic even, with high cheekbones and a straight nose that spoke of good breeding. But there was strength there too, a resilience that came from facing hardship with grace, rather than simply being born to comfort. "Good morning," she said as he stirred, her voice carrying none of the hoarseness he might have expected after a night spent in the open air. "Morning, Miss Whittemore." Jed stretched carefully, working the stiffness from muscles that protested spending a night on the hard ground. "Sleep at all?" "Some." She arranged her blanket more carefully around her legs. "I've grown accustomed to sleeping lightly when circumstances require it." That simple statement raised a dozen questions Jed didn't feel entitled to ask. How often had circumstances required her to sleep rough? What kind of life had taught a woman of obvious refinement to accept hardship with such equanimity? As he rekindled the fire from its remaining coals, Jed pulled his mother's worn leather Bible from his saddlebag, one of the few possessions he'd managed to salvage when he lost his horse. The book had belonged to Martha Carter, a woman who'd raised 3 sons on scripture and common sense, teaching them that true wealth came from character rather than coin. Its pages were soft with handling, marked with notes in her careful script that had guided him through more dark nights than he could count. "Your mother's?" Eloise asked, noticing his gentle handling of the book. "Yes, Mom. She always said a man needed 2 things to find his way in the world, a good compass and a good book." He showed her the brass compass his father had given him. "Got both from my parents, along with the understanding that neither's worth much unless you're willing to follow where they lead." Eloise studied both items with interest that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. Wise parents? Mine had different ideas about what constituted proper guidance. There was something in her tone that suggested a story worth hearing. But before Jed could pursue it, the sound of approaching wheels interrupted their quiet morning. A supply wagon crested the nearby ridge, its driver hunched against the cold and clearly eager to reach whatever destination awaited him down the trail. Jed waved him down, and the man, a grizzled teamster named Hopkins, proved willing to give them passage in exchange for what little money Jed had left and a promise to help with any trouble they might encounter along the way. "Heading toward Millfield," Hopkins explained as he helped Jed lift Eloise's wheelchair into the wagon bed. "Got supplies for the mining camp there. You folks welcome to ride along if that suits your direction." Eloise exchanged a meaningful glance with Jed. "That would be perfect, thank you." As they settled into the wagon for what Hopkins warned would be a rough journey, Jed noticed how naturally Eloise adapted to the uncomfortable conditions. She positioned herself to minimize the jarring of her wheelchair against the wagon's sides, and helped arrange their few belongings with an efficiency that spoke of considerable travel experience. "You've done this before," Jed observed as Hopkins urged his team forward. "More often than I'd prefer," she admitted. "Traveling in my condition requires a certain flexibility in one's expectations of comfort." The wagon lurched over a particularly rough section of trail, and Jed instinctively reached out to steady Eloise's wheelchair. Their hands touched briefly as she helped guide it, and he was surprised by the strength in her grip. These weren't the soft hands of a pampered woman, despite their apparent refinement. "Miss Whittemore," he said carefully, "those men last night seemed to know something about your business. If we're going to be traveling together, might be helpful if I knew what kind of trouble we might be riding toward." She was quiet for several minutes, watching the landscape roll by, as if weighing how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her words were carefully chosen. "I'm trying to reclaim something that was taken from my family," she said. "Property that rightfully belongs to me, but which certain parties have claimed through questionable means. Land dispute? You could call it that." Her tone suggested the matter was considerably more complex than simple boundary disagreements. "My mother's family owned considerable acreage in this territory. When she died, that land should have passed to me. Instead, it somehow found its way into other hands." Jed frowned. "Somehow? Legal documents have a way of disappearing when there's enough money involved," Eloise said with bitter experience. "Witnesses develop convenient memory problems. Judges discover pressing business elsewhere." The wagon hit another rut, and this time, when Jed reached to steady her, Eloise didn't let go of his hand immediately. The contact was brief, but spoke of trust that he suspected she didn't offer lightly. "That's why you're traveling alone," he realized. "Why those men were looking for you." "I'm not completely alone," she said with a slight smile. "I have you now." There was something in the way she said it that made Jed's chest tighten. Not flirtation. He wasn't fool enough to think a woman of her obvious quality would set her cap for a broken-down cowboy, but genuine appreciation for his willingness to stand with her. Hopkins called back from the driver's seat, interrupting the moment. "Riders coming up behind us, moving fast." Jed turned to look and felt his stomach drop. 3 men were approaching at a gallop, and something about their urgency suggested this wasn't a social call. As they drew closer, he could see that one of them was the larger man from the previous night. "Miss Whittemore," Jed said quietly, "I believe our friends have decided to continue last night's conversation." Eloise followed his gaze, and her jaw tightened. "Mr. Hopkins," she called to the driver, "how fast can this wagon travel?" "Not fast enough to outrun horses, ma'am," Hopkins replied grimly. "But I got me a shotgun up here if it comes to that." The riders were closing the distance rapidly, and Jed could see they were armed and determined. Whatever Eloise's business was, it had clearly made her some dangerous enemies. "There's something you should know," Eloise said suddenly, her hand moving to the hidden chain at her throat, "about who I really am, and why those men are so interested in stopping me." "Can it wait?" Jed asked, watching the approaching riders. "I'm afraid not." She pulled a small locket from beneath her dress, the source of the golden gleam he'd noticed earlier. The locket was ornate, expensive, and bore an inscription he couldn't read from his position. "My name is Eloise Whittemore, and my father is Marcus Whittemore of the Transcontinental Railroad Company." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Marcus Whittemore was one of the wealthiest men in America, a railroad baron whose empire stretched from coast to coast, which meant the woman he'd shared his last meal with, the woman he'd sworn to protect, was an heiress worth millions. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I think we need to have a longer conversation about exactly what kind of trouble you're in." The riders were close enough now that he could see their faces, and none of them looked like men who planned to be reasonable about whatever business they'd come to conduct. The revelation of Eloise's true identity hung between them like smoke from a gunshot as the riders closed the final distance. Jed's mind reeled with the implications. He'd been sharing hardtack with a railroad heiress, one of the wealthiest women in America, but there was no time to process the shock as Hopkins's wagon suddenly lurched to a halt. "That's far enough!" the lead rider called out, his horse dancing sideways as he blocked the trail ahead. "Miss Whittemore, we need to have ourselves a conversation." Hopkins kept his shotgun visible but didn't aim it, clearly hoping to avoid violence if possible. "This here's a public road, friend. You got no call to stop honest travelers." "Honest being the operative word," the second rider said with a cold smile. "And I'm afraid there's nothing honest about what this particular lady is up to." Jed helped Eloise down from the wagon, noting how she managed the transfer with practiced efficiency, despite the obvious difficulty of her situation. As he wheeled, Her chair closer to his side, he caught sight of something that made him do a double take, a silk handkerchief tucked into her sleeve, its edge embroidered with intricate gold thread that probably cost more than most men made in a month. The incongruity struck him forcefully. Here was a woman claiming to have been abandoned by fellow travelers, riding in broken-down conveyances and wearing plain clothes, yet carrying accessories that spoke of extraordinary wealth. The contradictions were piling up faster than he could make sense of them. "Gentlemen," Eloise said with remarkable composure, "I believe you have me confused with someone else. I'm simply traveling to visit family." The lead rider dismounted, his expression skeptical. "Family, is it? And would that family happen to own half the railroad rights between here and Chicago?" "I wouldn't know," Eloise replied evenly. "I'm not in the railroad business." "No, but your daddy sure is." The man stepped closer, and Jed moved to intercept him again. Marcus Whittemore's little girl, all grown up and making trouble just like her mama used to. At the mention of her mother, something flickered in Eloise's eyes, pain mixed with determination that told Jed this was about more than simple property disputes. "My mother's been dead for 15 years, she said quietly. "And her land's been put to good use in the meantime," the rider replied. "Folks around here have built lives on that property, made improvements, raised families. Seems a shame to upset all that progress over old paperwork." Jed was beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about one woman trying to reclaim her inheritance. It was about an entire web of corruption that had grown up around the illegal seizure of valuable land. "Old paperwork," Eloise repeated, her voice carrying an edge of steel. "Is that what you call legal deeds and land grants?" "I call it ancient history," the man said. "The kind that's better left buried." That was when Hopkins decided he'd heard enough. "Look here, you boys can jaw all you want about land rights and such, but I got supplies to deliver and daylight's burning. Either arrest somebody or move out of the way." The tension ratcheted up another notch as the three riders exchanged glances. Jed could see them weighing their options, violence in front of a witness versus letting their quarry continue toward whatever destination she had in mind. "Tell you what," the lead rider said finally, "Miss Whittemore, you come with us peaceable-like, and we'll see that your friend here gets safe passage to wherever he's headed." "That's not going to happen," Jed said before Eloise could respond. "Wasn't talking to you, cowboy. Maybe not, but I'm talking to you." Jed stepped fully in front of Eloise's wheelchair. "The lady's under my protection, and she's not going anywhere." "She doesn't want to go," the second rider laughed. "Your protection? With what? That moral superiority you've been wearing like armor?" It was true that Jed was outgunned and outnumbered, but he'd learned long ago that sometimes a man's willingness to stand his ground could shift odds that looked insurmountable on paper. "With whatever it takes," he replied simply. Eloise reached up and touched his arm lightly. "Mr. Carter, perhaps we should consider—" "No, ma'am," he interrupted gently. "Some things aren't negotiable." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until Hopkins cleared his throat loudly. "Well, this has been fascinating and all, but I got me a schedule to keep. Miss, you and your friend staying or going?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of another party. This time, it was a single rider, but he carried himself with an authority that made all three of the would-be kidnappers shift nervously in their saddles. The newcomer was a man in his 50s, well-dressed despite the rigors of frontier travel, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He surveyed the scene with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "Afternoon," he said pleasantly. "I don't suppose anyone would care to explain why armed men are blocking a public thoroughfare?" "Private business," the lead rider said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I see." The newcomer's gaze settled on Eloise, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or shared understanding. "Miss, might I inquire if these gentlemen are causing you difficulties?" Eloise studied him carefully before answering. "They seem to believe I'm someone I'm not." "Ah," the man nodded, as if this explained everything. "A case of mistaken identity. How unfortunate." He turned to the mounted men. "Gentlemen, I suggest you continue on your way. I'm sure you have pressing business elsewhere." There was steel beneath his polite words, and apparently the riders recognized it. After a moment of silent communication among themselves, they began backing their horses away from the wagon. "This isn't over," the lead rider said to Eloise. "No," she agreed quietly. "I don't suppose it is." As the three men rode away, the newcomer dismounted and approached the wagon. "Marcus Whittemore's daughter, unless I'm much mistaken," he said, with a slight bow. "I knew your mother, child. Remarkable woman." "You knew my mother?" Eloise's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing the depth of emotion that lay beneath her careful control. Indeed, Sarah Whittemore was a force of nature when she set her mind to something. I can see she passed that determination on to her daughter. He glanced at Jed with obvious approval, as well as her excellent judgment in choosing allies. Hopkins was growing impatient. "If we're all done with the family reunion, I'd like to get moving before those boys change their minds about leaving us be." As they prepared to continue their journey, the newcomer, who'd introduced himself as Judge Harrison, shared additional intelligence that made the scope of Eloise's mission clearer. Her mother's land encompassed not just valuable agricultural property, but the rights to a crucial railroad route that would be worth millions to whoever controlled it. "Your mother fought them for years," Judge Harrison told her as they traveled. "Right up until the end, she never stopped believing that justice would prevail." "And now?" Eloise asked. "Now it's your fight," he said simply. "The question is whether you have the stomach for what it's going to cost." Jed found himself studying Eloise with new eyes as the conversation continued. This wasn't just a woman trying to reclaim stolen property. This was someone carrying on a battle that had consumed her mother's final years. The weight of that legacy was visible in the way she held herself, the careful way she chose her words, the steel that lay beneath her refined exterior. As the day wore on, and they drew closer to their destination, Jed began to understand that he'd stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than a simple land dispute. But looking at Eloise, seeing the quiet determination in her bearing and remembering the trust she'd shown by revealing her true identity, he realized that he wouldn't have it any other way. Some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. Millfield emerged from the prairie like a fever dream of ambition and desperation, its muddy streets bustling with the peculiar energy that marked frontier boomtowns. Mining camps had a way of springing up overnight wherever men thought they could scratch fortune from the earth, and this one bore all the hallmarks of rapid, haphazard growth, hastily constructed buildings leaning against each other for support, signs advertising everything from whiskey to salvation, and the constant flow of humanity that came with the promise of easy money. Judge Harrison had parted ways with them at the edge of town, but not before pressing a folded paper into Eloise's, and offering words of caution that carried the weight of hard experience. "Be careful who you trust," he'd said quietly. "Your mother's enemies have had 15 years to entrench themselves, and they won't give up their gains without a fight." Now, as Hopkins guided his wagon down the town's main thoroughfare, Jed found himself taking careful note of their surroundings, with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to spot trouble before it spotted him. What he saw didn't inspire confidence. Too many hard faces watching their passage with more than casual interest. Too many conversations that stopped abruptly as they rolled by. Too many men whose hands rested casually near their weapons. "Popular place," he murmured to Eloise, who was conducting her own careful survey of the town. "So it would seem," she replied, but her attention had fixed on something specific, a large building at the far end of the street that bore a freshly painted sign reading, "Territorial Land Office." Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Hopkins, would you be so kind as to stop near that building?" Hopkins pulled his team to a halt outside the land office, and Jed helped Eloise down from the wagon while trying to ignore the increasing number of townspeople who'd found reasons to gather nearby. Their arrival was clearly not going unnoticed, and given the morning's confrontation, that probably wasn't good news. "I need to examine some records," Eloise explained as Jed positioned her wheelchair. "Legal documents that should be filed with the territorial authorities." "And you think they'll just hand them over?" Jed asked, noting how several of the watching men had moved closer. "They will if the documents exist," Eloise said with quiet confidence. "Public records are exactly that, public. Even corrupt officials rarely dare to destroy them outright, though they might file them in ways that make them difficult to find." As they approached the land office, a man emerged from the building with the quick step of someone who'd been watching their approach. He was well dressed in the manner of frontier professionals, clean shirt, pressed trousers, and boots that had seen polish more recently than trail dust. But there was something in his manner that suggested nervousness barely held in check. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I hope so," Eloise replied pleasantly. "I'm looking for land records pertaining to property in sections 12 through 18 of Township 4 North, Range 2 West. Specifically, documents filed under the name Sarah Whittemore." The man's smile faltered. "Whittemore? I'm not sure we have anything under that name. Records from that far back can be difficult to locate." Jed watched this exchange with growing interest. The official's reaction to Eloise's request was telling, not confusion or simple bureaucratic reluctance, but the specific nervousness of a man who knew exactly what she was looking for and why he didn't want her to find it. "Perhaps you could check your files," Eloise suggested, with the polite persistence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "I have reason to believe the documents were filed in 1861, following the death of my mother." "Your mother?" The man's eyes sharpened. "And you would be Eloise Whittemore, Sarah's daughter." The words hit the official like a physical blow. He stepped back involuntarily, his gaze darting to the growing crowd of onlookers as if seeking guidance or support. "Miss Whittemore," he said carefully, "perhaps this is a conversation better had in private. My office—" "The records I'm seeking are public documents," Eloise interrupted gently but firmly. "There's no need for privacy unless there's something about those records that shouldn't see daylight." That was when Jed noticed the man who'd been standing in the shadows near the building's corner, watching the proceedings with the focused attention of a predator sizing up prey. Unlike the others, he made no attempt to appear casual or coincidental. He was clearly there for a purpose, and that purpose clearly involved Eloise. "Miss Whittemore!" the man called out, stepping into the sunlight. "Interesting to see you here." Jed moved instinctively to place himself between the newcomer and Eloise, but she touched his arm lightly, signaling him to wait. "Mr. Crawford," she said with cool recognition, "I can't say I'm surprised to find you here." Crawford was a big man, not tall, but broad through the shoulders and thick through the middle, with the kind of presence that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money and intimidation. His clothes were expensive, his bearing confident, and his eyes held the calculating coldness of a man who viewed other people as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. "Come a long way from your father's mansion," Crawford observed, his tone carrying a mock concern that fooled no one. "Dangerous territory for a woman in your condition." "I can take care of myself," Eloise replied evenly. "Can you?" Crawford's gaze shifted to Jed, taking his measure with obvious skepticism. "With a broken-down cowboy as your only protection? That seems optimistic, even for a Whittemore." Jed felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. "Miss Whittemore's business is her own. I'm just here to see she's not bothered by folks who should mind their own affairs." Crawford laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You don't even know what you've gotten yourself into, do you, cowboy? This lady isn't just some traveler seeking justice. She's trying to undo 15 years of progress, destroy the livelihoods of honest people who've built something from nothing." "By honest people you mean yourself," Eloise said quietly. "Among others, We've turned worthless prairie into productive land, brought jobs and prosperity to this territory, and now you want to tear it all down over some moldy old papers that should have been forgotten years ago." Jed was beginning to understand the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about corrupt land deals. It was about an entire economic structure built on stolen property, with Crawford apparently at the center of it. "The papers you're referring to," Eloise said with icy politeness, "are legal deeds too. Property that was stolen from my family. Property that was never yours to distribute to anyone." "Stolen?" Crawford's voice rose slightly. "Your mother was paid fair compensation for that land. She was murdered before she could contest the sale," Eloise said flatly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Jed felt something cold settle in his stomach. Murder changed everything. It meant they weren't just dealing with corruption, but with people who'd already killed to protect their interests. Crawford's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Whittemore. The kind that could get a person into considerable trouble if they couldn't prove it." "The kind that could get a person killed if they could prove it," Eloise replied calmly. The crowd around them had grown larger, and Jed could see men positioning themselves at strategic points around the area, not obviously threatening, but clearly ready to move if the situation escalated. Whatever power Crawford wielded in this town, it was substantial enough that he could count on support from multiple quarters. From inside her sleeve, Eloise withdrew what appeared to be a carefully folded map, its edges yellowed with age but its contents still clear. Jed caught a glimpse of surveyor's marks and property boundaries before she held it where Crawford could see it. "This is the original railroad survey map," she said quietly. "The one that shows the true value of my mother's land, and why certain parties were so eager to acquire it through questionable means." Crawford's confident demeanor cracked slightly as he stared at the document. "Where did you get that?" "From someone who believed justice was more important than profit," Eloise replied. "Someone who kept copies of all the important documents, knowing that someday the truth would need to come to light." The land office official had backed away from the confrontation, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. But Crawford stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Eloise's wheelchair. "Miss Whittemore," he said quietly, "you're playing a very dangerous game, one that your mother lost, and that you could lose even more decisively." "Is that a threat, Mr. Crawford?" "It's a fact," he replied. "This territory has a way of dealing with troublemakers. Your mother learned that lesson the hard way." That was when Jed stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. "That sounds like a confession to me," he said quietly. Crawford turned his attention back to Jed, his eyes holding a contempt that was almost palpable. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it, Cowboy?" "Whatever needs doing," Jed replied simply. The tension in the street was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Jed could see hands moving toward weapons among Crawford's supporters. But before anyone could make the first move toward violence, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of another party, this one wearing badges and carrying the authority of federal law. The federal marshal's arrival shifted the dynamics in the street like wind changing direction before a storm. There were 3 of them, led by a grizzled veteran whose badge caught the afternoon sunlight with the authority of federal law. Crawford's supporters melted back into doorways and alleyways with the practiced ease of men who'd learned when to make themselves scarce, leaving only the principal players exposed in the sudden quiet. "Afternoon, folks," the lead marshal said, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man accustomed to walking into volatile situations. "Marshal James Tucker, out of Denver. We've had reports of some disturbance in this area." Crawford stepped forward with the confidence of a man who believed he could handle any situation through a combination of bluster and influence. "Marshal Tucker, there's no disturbance here. Just a business disagreement between myself and this young lady." "Business disagreement," Tucker repeated, his weathered face showing nothing of what he might be thinking. "And you would be?" "Thomas Crawford, president of the Millfield Development Company." I'm sure you understand how these territorial disputes can get heated, but there's no need for federal intervention. Tucker's gaze shifted to Eloise, taking in her wheelchair and the composed way she held herself despite being surrounded by hostile forces. "Ma'am, is this gentleman's assessment accurate?" "Marshal Tucker," Eloise said clearly, "my name is Eloise Whittemore, and I'm here to investigate the circumstances surrounding my mother's death 15 years ago, as well as the illegal seizure of property that rightfully belongs to me." The marshal's expression sharpened at the mention of murder and federal crimes. "Whittemore? Would that be Sarah Whittemore, the woman who owned land grants along the proposed Northern Railroad route?" "You know about my mother?" Eloise asked, surprise breaking through her careful composure. "Ma'am, your mother's case has been an open federal investigation for over a decade. We've been waiting for someone with standing to come forward and help us connect the pieces." Crawford's confident demeanor began to crack. "Federal investigation? On what grounds? Mail fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and violation of federal land grant provisions," Tucker replied matter-of-factly. "Your names come up in our files." "More than once, Mr. Crawford." The marshal turned back to Eloise. "Miss Whittemore, I understand you may have documents relevant to our investigation." Eloise reached into her traveling bag and withdrew what appeared to be a leather portfolio, its contents carefully preserved despite the years. "I have correspondence between my mother and various territorial officials, as well as copies of the original land grants and railroad survey maps." As she opened the portfolio, Jed caught sight of papers that looked far more official and comprehensive than the single map she'd shown Crawford earlier. There were letters bearing official seals, documents with multiple signatures, and what appeared to be a detailed accounting of financial transactions. Most importantly, Eloise continued, withdrawing a thin chain from around her neck, "I have this." The object hanging from the chain was a small key, brass and worn with handling, but clearly significant given the careful way Eloise handled it. "My mother's safe deposit box key," she explained. "She left instructions with her lawyer that if anything happened to her, the contents of that box should be preserved as evidence. It took me 15 years to track down the bank and gain legal access to it." Crawford had gone pale. "There was no safe deposit box. We searched—" He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd just admitted. "Searched for what, Mr. Crawford?" "Marshal," Tucker asked with professional interest, but Crawford had recovered his composure enough to refuse to answer without legal counsel present. The damage was done, however. His slip had confirmed that he and his associates had been actively trying to locate and destroy evidence of their crimes. Tucker assigned one of his deputies to take Crawford into custody for questioning while he continued gathering information from Eloise. As the situation developed, Jed found himself marveling at the quiet steel in Eloise's character. She wasn't just seeking justice for her mother's death. She'd spent 15 years methodically building a case that could bring down an entire network of corruption. "Miss Whittemore," Tucker said, "I'm going to need you to come with us to provide a full statement and turn over your evidence for examination. For your safety, I'd recommend federal protection until we can sort this all out." Eloise shook her head firmly. "Marshal, I appreciate the offer, but I have one more piece of business to complete before I can rest easy. My mother's wedding ring was stolen, along with everything else. It's been in our family for 3 generations, and I intend to recover it." "Ma'am, with respect, a ring isn't worth risking your life over." "This one is." Eloise's voice carried a conviction that brooked no argument. "It contains a hidden compartment with microfilm of additional documents, insurance my mother took against exactly what happened to her." Tucker stared at her with new respect. "Your mother was a remarkable woman." "Yes, she was. And she raised me to finish what she started." Jed stepped forward. "Marshal, if Miss Whittemore is determined to see this through, I'll stay with her and help however I can." "And you are?" Jedediah Carter. I've been helping Miss Whittemore with her travel arrangements. Tucker studied Jed with the practiced eye of a lawman sizing up a potential ally or threat. Whatever he saw appeared to satisfy him because he nodded. Slowly. Mr. Carter, are you aware of what you're volunteering for? The people involved in this conspiracy have already killed once to protect their interests. They won't hesitate to kill again. I understand, Jed replied simply, but some things are worth the risk. As the afternoon wore on, the scope of the conspiracy became clearer. Crawford's organization had been systematically acquiring valuable land through a combination of fraud, intimidation, and murder, building their wealth on the backs of legitimate property owners who couldn't fight back. Eloise's mother had been just one victim, but her case was the key that could unlock federal prosecutions against the entire network. The safe deposit box that Eloise's key would open was located in the territorial capital, a 3-day journey through some of the most dangerous country in Dakota Territory. Crawford's associates would undoubtedly try to stop them before they could reach it, which meant the trip would be as much about survival as justice. Miss Whittemore, Tucker said as his men finished gathering initial statements, I can't force you to accept protection, but I can't guarantee your safety if you insist on continuing this mission. Marshal, my mother spent the last 5 years of her life fighting these people. She died believing that someday justice would prevail. I won't dishonor her memory by stopping now when we're so close to the truth. Tucker nodded with obvious respect. Then Godspeed to you both. And remember, you're not just fighting for yourselves anymore. You're fighting for every honest person who's ever been cheated out of what's rightfully theirs. As the federal marshals prepared to escort Crawford and several of his associates back to Denver for formal charges, Jed found himself alone with Eloise for the first time since learning her true identity. The revelation had changed everything and nothing. She was still the woman who'd accepted his offered hardtack with grace, still the person who'd trusted him enough to reveal her mission, still someone worth protecting regardless of the cost. Missy Whittemore, he said quietly, are you sure about this? Once we leave town, there'll be no federal marshals to call on if things go wrong. Eloise looked at him with eyes that held both vulnerability and determination. Mr. Carter, I've been planning this moment for 15 years. I'm not going to stop now because it's dangerous. Then I reckon we'd better get ready for whatever's coming, Jed replied, as the sun began to set over Millfield, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed appropriate for what lay ahead. They began making preparations for a journey that would determine not just their fates, but the fate of justice itself. The ambush came at dawn, 3 miles outside Millfield, where the trail wound through a narrow canyon that offered perfect cover for gunmen and no escape for their targets. Jed had been expecting trouble. Men like Crawford didn't give up easily, and the federal marshal's intervention would only make them more desperate. What he hadn't expected was the sheer number of attackers who emerged from the rocks like wolves converging on wounded prey. "Get down!" he shouted to Eloise, throwing himself sideways as bullets whined overhead. Their borrowed wagon offered little protection, but it was better than being caught completely in the open. Eloise had already maneuvered her wheelchair behind the wagon's bulk with the swift efficiency of someone who'd learned to adapt quickly to danger. From her traveling bag, she produced a small pistol that looked well-maintained despite its obviously feminine design. "Can you use that?" Jed called over the sound of gunfire. "My mother made sure I learned," Eloise replied grimly, checking the weapon's cylinder with practiced movements. She said a woman alone needed to be able to protect herself. The attack was coordinated and vicious, with gunmen positioned on both sides of the canyon to create a deadly crossfire. But as the minutes passed and the shooting continued, Jed began to realize something was wrong with the tactical picture. The attackers had them pinned down, but they weren't pressing their advantage. They seemed to be waiting for something. That something arrived in the form of a single rider who approached under a white flag, his horse picking its way carefully through the rocks. As he drew closer, Jed could see it was a well-dressed man, in his 50s, someone who clearly wasn't accustomed to frontier violence but had been pressed into service for this particular mission. "Miss Whittemore," the man called out when he was within speaking distance, "I'd like to discuss terms for your surrender." "I'm not surrendering anything," Eloise called back. "I'm afraid you don't understand the situation," the man replied. "My name is William Brennan, and I represent certain interests that have a great deal to lose if you continue your current course of action." Jed had heard the name before. Brennan was a high-powered attorney from Chicago, the kind who specialized in making problems disappear for wealthy clients. His presence here meant the conspiracy reached much higher than they'd realized. "Mr. Brennan," Eloise said, "unless you're here to confess to your role in my mother's murder, we have nothing to discuss." Brennan dismounted and approached closer, clearly confident that his white flag would protect him. "Miss Whittemore, I think it's time you learned the full truth about your mother's death. The truth your father has been hiding from you all these years." Something in his tone made Jed's blood run cold. This wasn't the bluster of a man trying to buy his way out of trouble. This was someone who believed he held information that would change everything. "My father." Eloise's voice carried a note of uncertainty for the first time since Jed had known her. "Marcus Whittemore, railroad baron and your beloved father," Brennan said with cruel satisfaction. "The man who ordered your mother's death." The words hit Eloise like physical blows. Jed could see her recoil in her wheelchair, her face going pale as the implications sank in. "That's a lie," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Brennan reached into his coat and withdrew. "A leather folder. I have the telegraph records, Miss Whittemore. Messages between your father and Thomas Crawford detailing the arrangements for your mother's accident. It seems she'd discovered some irregularities in the railroad's land acquisition practices and threatened to expose them." He tossed the folder toward the wagon, and Jed retrieved it carefully, aware that this could be an elaborate deception, but unable to ignore the possibility that it contained genuine evidence. The documents inside were damning, telegraph messages, bearing what appeared to be Marcus Whittemore's signature, authorizing payments to Crawford for resolving the Sarah problem permanently. There were bank drafts, shipping manifests for suspicious cargo, and most damaging of all, a detailed plan for making Sarah Whittemore's death appear accidental. "It can't be true," Eloise whispered, but Jed could see doubt creeping into her eyes. As she examined the evidence, "Your father built his railroad empire on stolen land and murdered anyone who threatened to expose him," Brennan continued relentlessly. "Your mother was just one victim among many. The touching story of the grieving widower was all performance. Marcus Whittemore is a cold-blooded killer who spent 15 years manipulating his own daughter's grief to keep her from learning the truth." Jed felt sick as he watched Eloise's world crumble around her. Everything she'd believed about her mission, her family, her father's love, all of it was being called into question by evidence that looked disturbingly authentic. "Why are you telling me this?" Eloise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because the game has changed," Brennan replied. "Your federal marshal friends arrested Crawford and several others, but they're small fish. The real power behind this operation has always been your father, and he's decided it's time to cut his losses." From his coat, Brennan produced a telegram bearing recent postmarks. "This arrived this morning, your father's instructions regarding how to handle his troublesome daughter." Eloise took the telegram with trembling hands, and Jed watched her face go white as she read its contents. When she finished, she let the paper fall into her lap, as if it had burned her fingers. "What does it say?" Jed asked gently. Eloise's voice broke. "He says I'm to be eliminated as a threat to the family business, just like my mother." The revelation hung in the air like poison, transforming everything they thought they understood about Eloise's mission. She hadn't been seeking justice against her father's enemies. She'd been unknowingly working to expose her father himself. "Missy, Whittemore, Brennan said with mock sympathy, your father offers you one final chance. Abandon this crusade, turn over all evidence in your possession, and you'll be provided with a comfortable exile in Europe. Continue down your current path, and you'll meet the same fate as your mother. Jed looked at Eloise, seeing her struggle with the weight of betrayal and shattered illusions. The woman who'd spent 15 years planning to avenge her mother had just learned that her quest for justice would require destroying the father she'd loved and trusted. There's something else, Brennan added, clearly savoring his ability to inflict psychological damage. Your disability, Miss Whittemore? The riding accident that left you paralyzed when you were 12? It wasn't an accident. Your father arranged it to keep you from becoming too independent, too much like your mother. This final revelation broke something inside Eloise. She doubled over in her wheelchair as if struck by a physical blow, her composure finally shattered by the weight of accumulated betrayals. "You're lying," she gasped. "All of it. You're lying." "I'm afraid not," Brennan said with cold satisfaction. "Marcus Whittemore is a monster who's destroyed everyone who ever trusted him, including his own wife and daughter. The question now is whether you're going to let him destroy you completely, or whether you're going to choose survival over a justice that was never possible." Jed felt rage building in his chest as he watched Eloise struggle with revelations that would have broken a lesser person. But beneath the grief and shock, he could see something else emerging, a steel-hard determination that spoke of strength inherited from the mother she'd never stopped loving. "Mr. Brennan," Eloise said finally, her voice steady despite the tears. On her cheeks, "Please convey a message to my father, of course." Eloise straightened in her wheelchair, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd just found her true purpose. "Tell him that his daughter is indeed very much like her mother. Tell him that I will see justice done, regardless of the cost to myself or anyone else. And tell him that before this is over, he'll answer for every life he's destroyed in the name of profit." Brennan's confident demeanor flickered slightly. "Miss Whittemore, you're signing your own death warrant." "Perhaps," Eloise replied. "But some things are worth dying for. My mother understood that, and so do I." From around her neck, she withdrew not just the safe deposit box key, but a second chain that had been hidden beneath her clothes, hanging. From it was her mother's wedding ring, the ring that supposedly contained evidence that could destroy the entire conspiracy. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly, "you might want to inform my father that his efforts to recover this ring have been in vain. The evidence was never hidden inside it. The ring was just a decoy to draw attention away from where the real proof was hidden." Brennan stared at her with dawning horror. "Where?" Eloise smiled for the first time since learning the truth about her father. "Somewhere he'll never think to look. Somewhere that ensures even if he kills me, the truth will still come to light." The transformation was remarkable. In the space of minutes, Eloise had gone from a woman seeking to avenge her mother's murder to someone ready to expose the father who'd orchestrated that murder. The stakes had become personal in a way that transcended simple justice. This was now about saving other innocent lives from a monster who wore the face of family. "The offer stands for 1 more hour," Brennan said, remounting his horse. "After that, there will be no more negotiations." As he rode away, Jed moved to Eloise's side. "Are you going to be all right?" She looked up at him with eyes that held a new kind of fire. "Mr. Carter, I've just learned that everything I believed about my life was a lie. But I've also learned something else. I'm stronger than my father ever imagined possible, strong enough to finish what my mother started no matter what it costs." The sound of gunfire resumed as Brennan's white flag disappeared around a bend in the trail, but something fundamental had changed. They were no longer fighting just for justice. They were fighting for the right to expose a truth so terrible that powerful men would kill to keep it buried. The revelation of her father's betrayal had transformed Eloise from a woman seeking justice into someone forged by grief and determination, into something altogether more dangerous. As the gunfire resumed around their makeshift shelter, Jed watched her methodically check her pistol and survey their tactical situation with the cold calculation of someone who no longer had anything left to lose. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite everything that had just been revealed. Jed raised his head carefully above the wagon's edge, counting muzzle flashes and trying to gauge their opponent's positions. 8, maybe 10. They've got us surrounded. But they're not pressing the attack, still waiting for something. They're waiting for me to break, Eloise said with grim understanding. My father's instructions were probably to give me time to absorb the truth and make the sensible choice, to surrender. From his vest pocket, Jed withdrew his grandfather's Colt revolver, a weapon he'd managed to acquire in Millfield after selling the last of his possessions. The gun was old but well-maintained, its walnut grips worn smooth by generations of honest hands. It had belonged to men who'd fought for what they believed in, and now it would serve that purpose once again. "Miss Whittemore," he said quietly, "I need you to know something before we go any further. After hearing what that lawyer said about your father, if you want to walk away from this, I'll understand. Some fights aren't worth the cost." Eloise looked at him with eyes that held depths of pain and resolve he was only beginning to comprehend. "Mr. Carter, 15 years ago my father crippled me to keep me dependent on him. Then he spent the next decade and a half manipulating my grief and love to keep me from discovering his crimes. He turned me into a weapon against his enemies without ever telling me that he was the greatest enemy of all." She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to touch her paralyzed legs. "Do you know what the worst part is? Not that he killed my mother, though that's terrible enough. Not even that he destroyed my body to control my spirit. The worst part is that he made me love him for it. He made me grateful for his protection, dependent on his care, devoted to his memory of her." Jed felt something twist in his chest as he listened to her speak. The scope of Marcus Whittemore's cruelty was almost beyond comprehension. A man who'd systematically destroyed his own family to protect his business interests. "But he made one mistake," Eloise continued, her voice growing stronger. "He raised me to be like my mother, and my mother never backed down from a fight when innocent people were at stake." A bullet splinged off the wagon wheel near Jed's head, reminding them both that philosophical discussions would have to wait. But as they prepared to fight their way out of the canyon, Jed realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. What had begun as his simple desire to protect a helpless woman had evolved into something deeper, respect for someone whose courage far exceeded his own. "All right then," he said, checking his ammunition. "What's the plan?" Eloise reached into her traveling bag and withdrew what appeared to be a detailed map of the canyon, its markings suggesting she'd been planning for this possibility long before they'd encountered Brennan's ambush. "I've been studying the terrain," she explained. "There's an old mining trail that leads up the eastern wall about 50 yards from here. It's steep and narrow, but it would get us above their positions." "In a wheelchair?" Jed asked skeptically. "The chair stays behind. I can walk short distances when absolutely necessary, though it's difficult." She met his eyes steadily. "I've been hiding the extent of my mobility because it gave me an advantage when people underestimated what I could do." Another revelation, but this one offered hope rather than despair. If Eloise could manage the climb, they might have a chance of escaping the trap her father's men had set for them. "What about the evidence?" Jed asked. "If something happens to you," Eloise smiled with grim satisfaction. "That's the beauty of my mother's final gambit. The real evidence isn't in a safe deposit box at all. It's already been delivered to federal authorities in Washington. The key I've been carrying opens a box that contains nothing but newspaper clippings and family photographs. Then why? Because as long as my father believes the evidence is still hidden somewhere he can find and destroy it, he'll keep trying to capture me alive rather than simply having me killed." Her expression hardened. "But after today, after Brennan's revelations, That protection is gone. He knows I'll never stop hunting him, so he'll have no choice but to eliminate me. The tactical situation was becoming clearer. This ambush wasn't just about stopping Eloise's quest for justice. It was Marcus Whittemore's final attempt to clean up the loose ends of 15 years of murder and conspiracy, which meant they were fighting not just for their lives, but for the chance to ensure that justice would ultimately prevail. "Miss Whittemore," Jed said as they prepared to make their desperate climb, "there's something I need to tell you as well." She paused in her preparations, giving him her full attention. "When I first shared that hardtack with you, I thought I was helping a stranger in need. Then I learned you were an heiress, and I figured I was out of my depth, but determined to see you through whatever trouble you were facing." He met her eyes steadily, but somewhere along the way, this stopped being about duty or even simple decency. "What is it about?" she asked quietly. "It's about the fact that you're the strongest, bravest person I've ever known," Jed replied simply. "Rich or poor, walking or in a wheelchair, it doesn't matter. You're worth fighting for, and if we get out of this alive, I'd be honored if you'd let me keep fighting alongside you." Eloise stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through surprise, vulnerability, and something that might have been hope. "Mr. Carter, Jed, you understand what you're saying? What that would mean? I understand that I'd rather face whatever comes next with you than face safety without you," he said honestly. The moment stretched between them, intimate despite the bullets flying overhead and the death waiting in the rocks around them. Then Eloise reached out and took his hand, her grip strong despite everything she'd endured. "Then we'd better make sure we both survive this," she said with determination that left no room for doubt. They moved quickly after that, Jed helping Eloise from her wheelchair and supporting her as they began the treacherous climb up the canyon wall. Her mobility was indeed limited, but her upper body strength was considerable, and her determination seemed to overcome the physical limitations that would have stopped most people. Behind them, shouts indicated that their escape attempt had been discovered. Bullets began striking the rocks around them as they climbed, sending chips of stone flying and making every step a gamble with death. "There," Eloise gasped, pointing to a narrow ledge about 20 feet above them. "If we can reach, that will be above the main ambush positions." The climb was brutal, requiring them to trust handholds that crumbled under pressure and footholds that seemed designed more for mountain goats than humans. But as they climbed, Jed found himself marveling at Eloise's refusal to give up, despite pain that was clearly excruciating. They reached the ledge just as the first of their pursuers began following them up the cliff face. From their new position, Jed could see the full scope of the ambush, at least a dozen men positioned throughout the canyon, all heavily armed and clearly prepared for an extended siege. "Now what?" he asked, helping Eloise find a stable position. Among the rocks, she pointed toward the canyon's far end, where a plume of dust announced the approach of additional riders. "Now we find out whether my message to Marshal Tucker reached him in time." As if summoned by her words, the sound of gunfire erupted from the canyon mouth as federal marshals engaged Crawford's men in a running battle that would determine not just their immediate fate, but the ultimate success of Sarah Whittemore's 15-year quest for justice. "Your message?" Jed asked. Eloise smiled with satisfaction despite their precarious situation. "I sent a telegraph before we left Millfield, informing the marshals of our planned route and requesting assistance if we failed to reach our destination on schedule. I also included copies of some very interesting documents that implicate my father in multiple federal crimes." The woman was full of surprises, each one demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that left Jed wondering what other contingencies she'd planned for. But as the battle raged below them, and bullets continued to search for their position, he realized that all the planning in the world wouldn't matter if they couldn't survive the next few minutes. From their rocky perch, they could see the tide. of battle beginning to turn as the federal marshal's superior training and equipment began to tell against Crawford's hired guns. But they were still trapped on the cliff face, and several of their pursuers had managed to reach positions where they could bring effective fire to bear on the ledge. "Miss Whittemore," Jed said as he returned fire with his grandfather's Colt, "I want you to know that whatever happens next, I'm glad I was here to see you through this." "We're not finished yet," she replied with fierce determination. "My mother didn't fight for 15 years just to have her daughter give up at the moment of victory." As if to emphasize her point, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Marshal Tucker himself, leading a charge that would finally bring Marcus Whittemore's reign of terror to an end. Marshal Tucker's arrival changed everything. The federal lawmen came thundering into the canyon like avenging angels, their badges gleaming in the morning sun and their rifles speaking with the authority of federal justice. But the battle was far from over. Crawford's men had chosen their positions well, and they fought with the desperation of cornered animals who knew that capture meant the gallows. From their precarious perch on the canyon wall, Jed and Eloise watched the conflict unfold below them while trying to avoid the bullets that continued to seek their position. Several of Crawford's men had managed to work their way up the cliff face, and the narrow ledge that had seemed like salvation was rapidly becoming a trap with no escape route. "There," Eloise said, pointing to a folded document she'd withdrawn from her bodice. "The original land deed to my mother's property, the real one, with all the proper signatures and federal seals. This is what they've been trying to find and destroy for 15 years. Jed took the document carefully, noting the official seals, and carefully preserved signatures that would serve as definitive proof of Sarah Whittemore's legal ownership of the disputed territory. But as he examined it, he realized something that made his blood run cold. "Miss Whittemore," he said urgently, "this deed doesn't just cover agricultural land. According to these survey markers, your mother owned the water rights to the entire valley system, including the river that supplies water to 3 territorial mining districts. The implications hit both of them simultaneously. Marcus Whittemore hadn't just stolen valuable farmland, he'd illegally acquired control over the water resources that made the entire regional economy possible. The scope of his crimes was far larger than either of them had imagined. That's why he killed her," Eloise whispered. "It wasn't just about railroad rights or valuable property. He needed those water rights to maintain his stranglehold over the entire territory." Below them, the battle was reaching a crescendo as Marshal Tucker's forces pressed their advantage against the increasingly desperate ambushes. But the men climbing toward their position were close enough now that Jed could see their faces, and what he saw there wasn't encouraging. These were professional killers who'd been promised enough money to make the risk worthwhile. "Can you shoot?" he asked Eloise, checking the remaining ammunition in his grandfather's Colt. "Well enough," she replied, steadying her small pistol against a rock outcropping. "My mother made sure I learned to protect myself, though I doubt she imagined it would be against my own father's hired killers." The first climber appeared at the edge of their ledge, his gun already drawn and his finger tightening on the trigger. Jed's shot took him center mass, sending him tumbling back into the canyon with a scream that echoed off the stone walls. But there were others behind him, and the narrow confines of the ledge made defensive maneuvering almost impossible. "Miss Whittemore," Jed said as he reloaded, "if this goes badly, I want you to know something." "Don't," she interrupted firmly. "We're both getting out of this alive, and we're both going to see my father brought to justice. I won't accept any other outcome." Her determination was fierce enough to kindle hope even in their desperate circumstances. But reality was inexorable. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped with nowhere to retreat. The best they could hope for was to hold their position long enough for Marshal Tucker's forces to finish the battle below and come to their aid. 2 more climbers appeared simultaneously, forcing Jed to divide his attention between multiple targets, while Eloise engaged a 3rd man who'd found an alternate route up the cliff face. Her shot was clean and accurate, proving that her mother's lessons had been well learned, but the effort left her exposed to return fire that chipped stone dangerously close to her position. "Jed!" she called out as another wave of attackers began, ascending toward them. "The deed, if something happens to me, make sure Tucker gets it. Make sure everyone knows what my father really is." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Jed replied grimly, but he tucked the document inside his vest nonetheless. The land deed represented 15 years of Sarah Whittemore's struggle and her daughter's quest for justice. It couldn't be allowed to die with them on this god-forsaken cliff. The sound of gunfire from below was beginning to diminish as Tucker's forces gained control of the canyon floor, but the men climbing toward their position seemed oblivious to their comrades' fate. They climbed with single-minded determination, knowing that their only chance of survival lay in eliminating the witnesses who could testify to Marcus Whittemore's crimes. As Jed prepared for what might be their final stand, he found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. It had all started with a simple act of sharing his last meal with a stranger, but it had evolved into something far more significant, a fight for justice that would determine whether powerful men could continue to murder and steal with impunity. "Whatever happens next," he told Eloise as the climbers drew closer, "I want you to know that meeting you changed my life. You showed me what real courage looks like, and you showed me what real honor looks like," she replied. "Now let's show these bastards what happens when they threaten innocent people." The final assault began as the first climber gained the ledge, his gun blazing as he tried to overwhelm their defenses through sheer aggressive action. The final confrontation erupted with volcanic intensity as 3 gunmen reached the ledge simultaneously, their weapons blazing in a desperate attempt to overwhelm Jed and Eloise through sheer firepower. The narrow confines of their rocky shelter became a battlefield where every inch mattered and every bullet could determine life or death. Jed's grandfather's Colt spoke with deadly precision, its bullets finding their targets with the accuracy born of desperation and righteous anger. But for every attacker he dropped, another seemed to take his place, climbing with the relentless determination of men who knew their own lives depended on eliminating the witnesses to their employer's crimes. Eloise fought beside him with a courage that left him speechless, her small pistol cracking steadily as she picked off climbers with shots that would have made her mother proud. But ammunition was running low, and their defensive position was being steadily eroded by the sustained assault. "Jed!" she called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "The water rights deed. It's not just evidence of my father's crimes. It's the key to undoing 15 years of illegal development throughout the territory." "What do you mean?" he asked while quickly reloading. "Every mining operation, every railroad spur, every town that's been built using water from that river system, they're all operating illegally. If those water rights revert to their rightful owner, it will bankrupt half the territorial power structure." The scope of what they were fighting for suddenly became even clearer. This wasn't just about justice for Sarah Whittemore's murder. It was about dismantling an entire network of corruption that had stolen the future from countless honest settlers and workers. A gunman appeared at the ledge's edge, his rifle trained on Eloise's position. Jed's shot took him before he could fire, but the man's death cry alerted his companions to their exact location. The next assault would be coordinated and overwhelming, designed to end the resistance once and for all. "Miss Whittemore," Jed said quietly, "if this doesn't go our way, I want you to know that fighting alongside you has been the greatest honor of my life." She reached out and took his hand, her grip steady despite the chaos around them. "And you, Mr. Carter, have shown me what it means to have someone truly stand with you against impossible odds." The moment was interrupted by the sound of boots scraping against stone as the final wave of attackers began their ascent. But just as Jed prepared to make their last stand, the sharp crack of rifle fire erupted from multiple positions around the canyon rim. Marshal Tucker's sharpshooters had finally gained commanding positions, and their accurate fire began picking off the climbers with methodical precision. "Federal Marshals!" Tucker's voice boomed across the canyon. "Throw down your weapons and surrender, or face the consequences." The effect was immediate and decisive. The remaining attackers, caught between the deadly fire from above and Jed's position on the ledge, began throwing down their weapons and calling out their surrender. The siege was over, and justice had finally arrived in force. As the immediate danger passed, Jed helped Eloise into a more comfortable position among the rocks while they waited for rescue. The ordeal had taken its toll on both of them, but there was something in her expression that spoke of profound satisfaction rather than mere relief. "It's over," she said quietly. "After 15 years, it's finally over." "The fighting's over," Jed agreed, "but the real work is just beginning. Bringing your father to justice, restoring the stolen lands, making sure this can never happen again, that's going to take time." Eloise nodded, her hand moving to touch the land deed that had cost so many lives to preserve. "My mother started this fight, knowing she might not live to see it finished. Now it falls to us to honor her sacrifice by seeing it through to the end." Marshal Tucker's voice called up from below. "Miss Whittemore, Mr. Carter, are you injured?" "We're all right," Jed called back. "But we have evidence up here that's going to change everything." As federal agents began the careful process of lowering ropes to extract them from their rocky perch, Eloise turned to Jed with an expression that held both exhaustion and hope. "When this is all over," she said quietly, "when the trials are finished and the land is restored to its rightful owners, I'm going to need help rebuilding what my father destroyed. Not just the property, but the trust, the community, the hope that justice can prevail." "Are you asking me to stay?" Jed asked. "I'm asking you to help me build something better than what came before," she replied. "A place where people like my mother's memory can be honored, where honest folks can make honest livings without fear of powerful men who think they can steal whatever they want." Looking into her eyes, Jed saw not just the woman who'd accepted his shared hardtack with grace, but a partner worthy of any challenge they might face together. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. "Miss Whittemore," he said with a smile that reflected his heart's certainty, "I can't think of anything I'd rather do." As the ropes reached their position and federal agents began the careful process of bringing them down to safety, both of them knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. 3 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the valley that had once been stolen from the Whittemore family, painting the landscape in shades of gold that seemed to promise better days ahead. The federal trials in Denver had concluded with convictions that sent shockwaves through the territorial power structure. Marcus Whittemore himself sentenced to life in federal prison, Thomas Crawford and his associates facing the gallows, and a network of corruption finally exposed to the cleansing light of justice. Jed Carter stood on the porch of the newly constructed house that overlooked the reclaimed valley, watching as teams of honest workers began the process of restoring what 15 years of illegal exploitation had damaged. The water rights had been returned to their rightful owner, the stolen lands redistributed to their original claimants, and the railroad routes renegotiated under federal oversight to ensure fair compensation for all affected parties. "Admiring your handiwork?" Eloise asked from behind him, and he turned to see her approaching in the new wheelchair they'd commissioned from a craftsman in Denver. Lighter, more maneuverable, and equipped with improvements that reflected both her practical needs and her refusal to let physical limitations define her capabilities. "Our handiwork," he corrected, moving to meet her at the porch's edge. "None of this would have been possible without your mother's courage and your determination to see her fight through to the end." The transformation in Eloise over the past months had been remarkable to witness. The burden of grief and betrayal that had weighed on her so heavily during their desperate journey had been replaced by a sense of purpose that energized everything she touched. She'd thrown herself into the work of restoration with the same fierce determination that had carried her through the darkest moments of their adventure. "Judge Harrison stopped by this morning," she said, holding up a legal document with obvious satisfaction. "The final property transfers have been approved. Every acre that was stolen from my mother has been returned to its rightful owners, and the federal compensation fund is ready to begin payments to families who suffered under my father's regime." Jed took the document and read through its formal language, marveling at how dry legal prose could represent such profound justice. Hundreds of families would receive restitution for years of exploitation, and the precedent established by the federal prosecution would make it much harder for such large-scale corruption to take root in the future. "There's something else," Eloise continued, her tone carrying a note of nervous anticipation. "Something I've been wanting to discuss with you." She reached into her traveling bag, the same one that had carried her evidence through their dangerous journey, and withdrew a small, simple object that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. It was a plain gold wedding band, unadorned but beautiful in its simplicity, the kind of ring that spoke of enduring love rather than ostentatious display. "This was my grandmother's ring," Eloise explained, her voice soft but steady. "It's been in our family for 3 generations, passed down from mother to daughter as a symbol of love that transcends whatever challenges life might bring." Jed felt his heart begin to race as he understood what she was offering, but he needed to be certain. "Miss Whittemore, Eloise, are you asking what I think you're asking?" She smiled with the same quiet courage that had carried her through their ordeal. "Mr. Carter, Jed, I'm asking if you'd be willing to build a life with me. Not because you feel obligated by what we've been through together, but because you want to share whatever comes next." "Eloise," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been wanting to ask you the same question for weeks, but I wasn't sure a broken-down cowboy had any right to hope for a future with a woman like you." "A woman like me?" she repeated with amusement. "You mean a woman whose father was a murderer, whose family fortune was built on blood and corruption, who can't walk without assistance and comes with enough enemies to populate a small town? I mean a woman with enough courage to fight an impossible battle for 15 years, enough strength to face the truth about her father and still choose justice over safety, and enough grace to share her last meal with a stranger when she had every reason to look out for herself alone." He knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Eloise Whittemore, I'd be honored to spend the rest of my life building something worthy of your mother's memory, alongside the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known." Her answer came not in words, but in the way she leaned forward to kiss him. A kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings, and the promise of adventures yet to come. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling with the joy of people who'd found something precious in the midst of chaos. "I suppose this means we'll need to plan a wedding," Eloise said with practical consideration that made him laugh. "I suppose it does. Though I should warn you, I'm not much for fancy ceremonies. A simple service with honest folks would suit me fine." "That sounds perfect," she agreed. "After everything we've been through, simple and honest sounds like the greatest luxury imaginable." As they sat together on the porch, watching the sun climb higher over the valley that would soon be home to dozens of families reclaiming their rightful heritage, Jed reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. It had all started with a broken piece of hardtack shared between strangers, but it had become something infinitely more valuable. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose and love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than steel. "You know," he said, putting his arm around her shoulders, "people are going to talk about us for years to come. The starving cowboy and the railroad heiress who brought down an empire of corruption." "Let them talk," Eloise replied with contentment. "The only story that matters is the one we write together from here forward." As if to emphasize her point, a wagon approached down the valley road, carrying the first of many families who would be returning to reclaim land that had been stolen from them years before. Children's laughter drifted across the morning air, and Jed could see hope in the faces of parents who'd never dared believe justice might someday prevail. Their story had become legend throughout the territory, not of riches or royalty, but of a starving cowboy whose last crust of bread had opened the door to a love that rewrote both their fates and brought justice to countless others. But for Jed and Eloise, the real adventure was just beginning.